Good morning, Journey, and happy Sabbath. Welcome to another edition of Lee Sabbath School. I was trying to say something really fancy, kind of like French-wise, but like it really didn't work. Welcome to Ye Old Sabbath School. There we go. I was trying to save it. I don't know if it worked, Jesus, so you can let me know. Welcome to another edition. I think we are on the 10th Sabbath School lesson of the quarter. Honestly, though, for what we want to do today, is we actually want to dive into Isaiah 52 and 53 to talk about the suffering servant prophecy found in Isaiah and what that means, what that meant for Jesus's context when Jesus entered the scene, and what that means for us today. Maybe not today, but maybe sometime soon. Because with the Sabbath School lesson, especially with the beginning story and some of the, and a lot of the rhetoric around Christianity, actually, about the Christian faith and discipleship and whatnot, we have this whole slave analogy and slave metaphor. And I don't know about you, Jesus, but when I was reading that, like, it made me really uncomfortable. And so I'm like, something I'm just starting to ponder and starting to wonder, and maybe you guys can like wonder aloud with me and like help me process through comments and stuff, and fill out the jot form, and maybe we can get some communication going and kind of like start to process this. Is there language we can use to convey the idea of serving Christ and following Christ, belonging to Christ, without tapping into such a problematic and damaging trope? Yeah.
You know what I think? You know what I think it is? It's like, because I understand what you're saying with the term slave, and so often the connection is slave kind of being the lowest status that you could be within a society, and so we like to make that connection with like, yeah, Jesus came to be that, right, the lowest of the low, to be able to save us, and I understand it, but I think what makes it so problematic is that that's a human that's a human concept. Like, we have created, like, the fact that we as humans have created that another human being is not as valuable as yourself. I think that's where the problem lies, and we're so comfortable with that language of you are less than me.
Yeah,
that's the problem for sure.
and like, so I mean, I get that with Jesus, because of who Jesus was, but Jesus also can't be completely separated or divorced from Jesus' culture. And we have to acknowledge the fact that in many of these cultures, slavery was permitted. And a lot of people try to make the argument, oh, well, it was a different than the type of slavery that we saw with Europe and colonialism in the West, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, yeah, we need to be very careful when we have those conversations and when we throw those things around. And quite honestly, between you and me, it's usually white people throwing that around. You know, oh, well, it wasn't that bad in their. I'm like, owning people is still bad.
Yeah.
Whatever context what you're doing it, exploiting people and not paying them or not giving them enough to survive with, mistreating people and exploiting people is not okay. And so that's just kind of a thought that maybe for later, maybe we can unpack, maybe we can find another analogy, another metaphor, because metaphors change over time, and metaphors change between cultures, and metaphors change, and metaphors have more or less meaning or different meanings between cultures and different times. So maybe we can find something more appropriate to our context over time. That's just something I was kind of thinking about from reading over this lesson, because how casually they drop it, and it's just like,
Right.
But we want to talk about Isaiah 52 and 53, and this is the suffering servant prophecy in Isaiah. And what we want to do is we want to read this text, and then we want to have a talk about messianic expectation and disappointment. So Jesus, if you have that text available, you want to start reading for us?
Sorry, like, you got me caught up on this whole slave thing. Like, I'm like, wait a minute, this is actually very bad what this lesson is saying in the beginning.
Yeah, no, I mean the story is yeah, like isn't this a great thing that this dude did, willingly putting himself in slavery in order to preach to people? And the moral of the story was, see, all these people came to Jesus. Isn't that great?
And here's where I say yes and no. And no, it's because it's like, yo, you ask any one of those, right? It says until 200 people, right? Any of those 200 people, you ask them, like, is this a position you want to be in? And their answer is going to be no. And for him to put himself in that position and be like, I'm going to, and so it's like, what do you mean? And then it says we're liberated, and okay, you would think what would follow would be like, actual physical freedom, but it says liberated from hopelessness. And it's like,
Well, and here's the problem, right? And we kind of talked about this last Sabbath, when we over spiritualize things.
Yeah.
When we go, oh, well, they got liberated from their hopelessness and they got liberated from their sins. And yes, that's true. Sure. Absolutely. On a metaphysical level, absolutely. However, they're still in slavery. And the liberation that we should be seeking, and we should have sought there, was there shouldn't be slaves in those mines, or I think it's mines, in the first place. Yeah. There shouldn't be slaves in those mines in the first place. Like, and as Christians, all too often we go, well, isn't this a great sign of the gospel? For me, it's like, yeah, but gospel also would have been breaking those chains and getting those people out of there.
Right.
And maybe that's part of the reason why this whole analogy really bothers me is in fact, this is kind of the rhetoric that a lot of people have used for enslaved peoples here in the United States. Over spiritualizing it and using the gospel as a means to kind of give them hope for a better life after this one, but also reminding them this is why you have to stay here in this, and using Christianity and using the scriptures to justify what they were doing to people.
Bro, honestly, like everything like you're saying is true, but it's so complex because I feel like it gives leeway to a lot of different things. So like you were saying, like, the gospel would have been like the actual physical freedom, and I agree. And I think that's what the gospel is. But it's like, well, does that allow for war then? Does that allow for like innocent bloodshed in the taking of trying to get that physical freedom? And then another thing is like, now we're sounding like the people during Jesus' time who were wanting that freedom too. And we wanted Jesus to be like, no, freedom means physical freedom, like free us. But Jesus was like, actually, I'm just going to die. And so that's why I'm kind of like, wait, I hear what you're saying, but then low key, I'm hearing what the lesson is saying too. So I'm kind of stuck.
Right. And I think it's okay to be in that tension. I mean, because scripture uses the term doulos and stuff all the time. And people try to like sanitize that by using the term servant and stuff, and they try to like, make it sound a little less squidgy. And we do have to live in that tension, right? We have to keep in mind that Jesus was not only the person that was led like a lamb to the slaughter, but Jesus was also the person that flipped tables in the temple.
Mm. And then the question there to ask is, but like, why was he flipping tables? Yeah, it was in the house of the Lord too, but it goes beyond that. It's even in that what was happening during the temple, it was still an act of oppression to people. And I think that's, all my life I've been told, like, it's because it's the house of the Lord and the reverence, and you can't have this, the animals were there, this and that, all that. But it's like, no, Jesus flipped tables because what they were doing was completely wrong to other people. But
so it's tough, right? And that's why I think that opening up for dialogue is important. That we as a community come together and we talk about this. And kind of my main point is there better language we can use? Or is there different language we can use that can still convey some of the base ideas that they're trying to convey in the original context?
Someone could argue no, I feel like, because because slave carries such a heavy weight, they would be like, what else would convey that meaning? Like, there's nothing else that could convey what slavery conveys. Like that could be an argument.
Right. Well, and maybe we have to go like with the sense of intimacy and more relational, maybe because remember, because the whole slave analogy is also this idea of debt, and also this idea of I guess essentially being beholden to another and working for another. And I mean, and especially with our context where it's not a willing consensual arrangement. I think the consent is incredibly important, and I think that free will is consent in its purest form. So if God died for free will to give us the option, the choice to live eternally with God, then consent is incredibly important to the will and the mind and the heart of God. And so that's why the language, if it wasn't problematic in its original context, which I wonder, is definitely problematic today. So I wonder if some way to like talk about like this closeness, this deepness, this. See, and I don't know. Do we have to put labels on it? Like, can't we just be followers of Jesus? Can't we just, seek to have such a close personal relationship with Jesus? It's hard to see where I end and Jesus begins.
Right.
Well, maybe marriage is the best analogy, or is a good analogy, right? But then, of course, I want to be mindful of that because I don't want to make romantic love a penultimate expression of not only human experience, but also of experiencing God, right?
Right.
You see, and this is why the semantics are important, but this is why the semantics are also incredibly difficult, and why a lot of people just don't want to mess with them.
Right.
Because once you start because deconstructing is easy, like tearing it down is easy. It's trying to build something back up in its place. That's where it's difficult.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so true.
And so, I mean, so thank you, Journey, for coming along with us on this kind of ride here. Like, we're trying to muse and we're trying to figure out a way to, because what it ultimately boils down to is how can we be responsible with the text, and how can we be responsible with the ideas and the principles that Christ is trying to convey to us, and how can we also be responsible socially and in our current context, and how can we be responsible because we're dealing with people here.
Right.
We're not dealing with concepts, we're not dealing with abstracts, we're not dealing with just principles, we're dealing with people.
Yeah.
And we have to be mindful of that. For example, even like using the idea of God as Father, that sort of language, while granted it's the best language that Jesus had to try to talk about Jesus' relationship with God, like trying to convey to the context at the same time, even in his context and in our context, there are people whose only experiences with, quote, fathers has been incredibly negative. And so that God as Father is actually like triggering to them.
Right.
So, I mean, that's part of the problem with language, right? As Wittgenstein would say, not only are we like language almost hinders our transmission of concepts at times.
Yeah.
I mean, how many times have we had it before where you're like, well, I didn't mean to say it that way, or I didn't mean to say that, or that wasn't my intention. And as one of the things that I've always said, and as my wife says, is that intention's irrelevant a lot of the time. Your intent, what you meant to say, it doesn't actually matter as opposed to what is actually said.
See, and that's so deep because it's like, no, like my intentions, like this is my intention, And then we're always told, like, be intentional with what you do, be intentional. But it's like, Miss Cassandra has a point. To a certain extent, intentions are irrelevant.
You know, and maybe that's part of where this, like, and so Wittgenstein would say that language actually hinders our ability to, but then at the same time, I would push back on Wittgenstein and I'd be like, at the same time though, that's what we have.
Right.
We don't have anything else. Our language is what we have. And as my wife demonstrates time and time again, we can be exact with our language.
Mm.
It takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of mindfulness, but we can, over time, to the best of our abilities, get it to the point where what we are meaning to say is what we are saying. And I know a lot of people push back against, quote, cancel culture and social justice warriors and all this stuff, which, by the way, I'm still confused on why caring about people is a bad thing. But this idea that people are people and we should treat people well.
Right.
And we should, and in our humor and in our dialogue and in our stories and in our Sabbath school lessons, we should never punch down.
Mm.
You know, and I think we have to be mindful about the language that we are using. I think that what would actually have been helpful in the Sabbath school lesson is that they had actually started out saying, we understand the baggage that comes with this term.
Yeah.
And we understand the atrocities and the horrors that this word carries with it in all of these different contexts. Maybe that would have helped, but I don't know. Like, we understand that Christ came to serve, not to be served, and to give his life as a ransom for many. In Isaiah, we understand that Christ took our place, right? And that Christ basically took what we deserved onto Christ's self. Very much tying in with a satisfaction or substitution theory of the atonement. And I think that maybe that's part of our problem too, is that when we're dealing with concepts, because I was actually just talking about this with a class recently, is that when we talk about salvation, we're actually talking about one of the most nuanced and one of the most complicated doctrines that we have, if not the most.
Yeah.
In fact, the Nicene, like the Council of Nicaea and Chalcedon and all these other things, like establishing, trying to settle on the identity of Jesus was actually mostly due to trying to wrap our heads around the idea of salvation. That in order to understand how salvation works, we have to understand who Jesus is. And in order for this mystery to work the best we can understand it, Jesus has to be simultaneously 100% human, 100% divine, without separation or division or confusion. And yeah, no, I mean, and dude, we haven't even gotten into the theories of atonement yet.
Right.
Right. And is salvation objective or subjective? And even those terms are loaded, and those terms have different nuances depending on who you're talking to. And is salvation a gift or a task? And I mean, if you think about it, the Christian church has wrestled with this throughout its entire history. How much of it is God and how much of it is us? Right? And that's the issue that we come into. Is this is why I think, like, was, for example, with concepts like this, why we're spending time on it, is we have to understand that our language and the words that we say can bring healing to people, but they can also bring harm to people. And in trying to transmit the gospel, we want to bring life, not death. We want to bring healing, not harm.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's why we, at the very least, this is a very important exercise to undergo. To look at our language, to look at our analogies, to look at our symbolism, to look at our words and ask ourselves, how accurately does this convey what we are trying to convey? And you know what? To some degree, I don't know. Um, I find myself using tropes, and I find myself using analogies and using examples and whatnot that are outdated and problematic from time to time. Because it's, I mean, it's what you grow up with, it's what you've been kind of inundated with. And,
Right.
you know, and sometimes we fall back on them, especially if we don't know what to say. For example, a Christian who encounters suffering, especially the death of someone's loved one. And there's that always that awkward, I don't know what to say moment. And then in that awkward silence, the Christian will try to fill it with something. And usually they'll fall back on cliches and platitudes that they've grown up with. And those might not necessarily be appropriate for the context.
Right.
You know, for example, I can't tell you how many times Adventists at memorial services will say stuff like, oh, so and so is watching me from heaven, or so and so is in heaven right now. I'm like, Adventists, I mean, State of the Dead, but I've noticed that in moments of trauma and grief, and in moments of awkwardness, and in moments where they don't, of uncertainty, sometimes we'll fall back on things that we've been conditioned with, whether or not we actually believe it or agree with it now. And I don't know. So maybe I know that others have started some of these conversations, and I know we're not the first to have this particular conversation. But maybe something from this lesson, like, let's be real, okay? This lesson is pretty straightforward on the fact, yes, Jesus, especially Jesus from Isaiah, is a suffering servant, has come to be a sacrifice for us, has suffered for us and because of us, and suffer so we don't have to, you know, at some point in the future. And yeah, that's all well and good. But honestly, I think that's rather, I mean, as far as Christianity goes, that's kind of like Christianity 101.
Right.
Important to refresh on, but most of the people reading the Sabbath School lesson got that. Perhaps a useful, a good use of our time, especially with since Sabbath School is that part is supposed to get us thinking a little more, right? A little more cerebral, is what I would challenge all of you watching this to do is to examine your rhetoric and semantics as a Christian. Examine what you say as a Christian. And ask yourself, have I ever said something that has come off as callous, uncaring, cruel, flippant, dismissive, judgmental, you know, all these different things. And I'll tell you right now, as a pastor who has dealt with a lot of death over the last almost decade, like I'll tell you right now that memorial services and funerals and whatnot are the place where Christians usually get it the most wrong.
Mm.
Because it makes us super uncomfortable. And when we get uncomfortable, oftentimes we say things that we probably shouldn't say. And so maybe that's our challenge this week for you all. Like, by all means, please read the lesson. And if there's something from the lesson that you thought was really cool and really worth noting and noticing and mentioning, please fill out the jot form that's going to be at the bottom in the description here for the video, and let us know. Maybe you vehemently disagree with what we're talking about today, and the language is fine, and we're the problem, not the text. Okay, fill out the form, reach out to us, let's have a dialogue, let's talk about it. Yeah? But in the meanwhile, I challenge you to look at your rhetoric, to look at the words that you say and how you say them. And with everything we say as Christians, does this glorify Christ? Or does this put Christ into a box that Christ didn't want to be in?
Mm.
Does this uplift and edify people? Does this heal people, or does this harm people? Does this break people down? Does this hurt people? Does this judge people? Like, you know, and I think that's an important thing for us to do. Bit of a tangent here. But we want to thank you all for joining us today as we perhaps had a conversation starter. Please join us next week as we continue on our conversation with Isaiah and our conversation with the Sabbath School lesson. Until next time, remember, if you like what you're seeing here, subscribe to the channel, share it with somebody. But remember, most importantly, that God loves you very much. Remember to love each other, and remember that we at Journey SDA love you, and no distance can change that. We'll see you later.